However, it is not Uther who creates ruin with his actions, although, as we said, the result of his approach would also be the fall of the kingdom. He is still a reactive subject, unlike the prince who is actively involved in creating evil. What, then, separates these two? Certainly years and experience, but also the fact that Uther is in the service of the light and authority, while Arthas is authority itself. Not only does his young soul hold on to the principles of the knightly order to which he belongs, still untroubled by doubts and perplexities regarding the sacred mission and his own role in it, or the cynicism leading to inconsistencies, but he also feels the additional burden to take action to resolve the difficult situation facing his kingdom. Returning to Uther's advice regarding Arthas' desire to immediately strike the orcs who devastated the population of Stranbrad, we can say that this is the first point where we delve deeper into the dynamics of their relationship. Uther serves as a source of lessons or warnings meant to guide Arthas in decision-making, akin to a perennial handbook tied to the teachings of the Paladin Order. The fact that he has the freedom to declaim wisdoms without the obligation to supplement it with practical solutions might create an impression of him being a voice of reason or a guardian angel on the shoulder, serving as a corrective factor. However, such an interpretation misses the essence, and this becomes more apparent as the story progresses, leading us to different, complex questions. What can be done when faced with a problem neither has experience with? What advice to give when a schema of encouragements, terms, teachings, and arguments that make up a worldview conflicts with a radically altered reality? How to behave when conflicting visions arise among loved ones? Such challenges gradually yield their bitter fruits, and while initially idyllic, the interaction between teacher and student becomes increasingly strained due to the complication of the kingdom situation, eventually becoming openly hostile before the walls of Stratholm. In this regard, we can highlight the sequence of Stranbrad, Hardclan, Stratholm, which clearly shows that Uther's approach to the problem, as well as the wisdom he offers, is increasingly ineffective in collision with intolerable reality, culminating in the most recognizable mission, namely the massacre of Stratholm's population. The cult status that this chapter has is well earned, not only because of the dramatic nature of the situation and the gloominess of the atmosphere, but precisely because at this point we encounter the essence of the difference between Arthas and Uther, as we discussed earlier, reflected in the following question. Can a paladin be pragmatic? What separates the two protagonists is the fact that Uther does not face the burden of making decisions with far-reaching consequences and the lack of time for contemplation, unlike Arthas, which in itself is related to the nature of human expectations of authority, state, order, system, however it may be called. Because regardless of the catastrophic or moral unacceptability of the situation, a significant number of people will not react negatively or recognize the problem, at least for a while adhering to the idea that what they see or hear is part of a plan, a controlled experiment, state reason, or something similar. However, there is a significant probability that the same people will react negatively in case that the lack of action by the authorities leaves them to the vagueness or haziness of the situation for a long time, without a clearer compass for action and without the possibility to reduce the complex situation to clear and often binary categories. This is precisely what I see as the reason for the prophet's decision to approach Arthas, but not Uther. However, as the game shows us, a plan or state reason also has its ominous side, so Arthas, having previously discarded the prophet's warnings, decides at this point to exterminate the infected population to prevent further spread of the plague. The moral unacceptability of such a decision leads Uther to refuse the command, which is why he is expelled. Arthas, judging by the logic of Leszek Kulakowski, is a consistent actor. Jaina also goes with him since she is unwilling to watch Arthas carry out the plan. This segment is therefore often seen as a choice between a practical solution and a clear conscience, although this is not the only dilemma. Having shown the difference between the heroes of the human campaign and somewhat explained the idea that Jaina rather than Uther is the immediate antithesis to Arthas, we can shift our attention to an additional level of interpretation, the so-called problem of conjecture. Like any complex phenomenon, this can be observed on multiple levels, but for the sake of our argument, we will turn to Henry Kissinger. As Niall Ferguson states, Kissinger believed that in situations where the stakes are high, decisions must be made before all facts are gathered. His idea is that the choice between policies does not reside in the facts, but in their interpretation. It involved a moral assessment, an estimate which depended for its validity on a conception of goals as much as on an understanding of the available material. Even if we allow for the idea that gathering all facts is possible or even useful, we must acknowledge that rulers are often faced with the problem of the cost of prevention without the confirmation or recognition that should result from it. Imagine if France, the United Kingdom, or the Soviet Union had struck Germany in 1938 immediately after the annexation of the Sudetenland. Regardless of whether we are talking about the immediate cost for democratically elected governments or the long-term cost of spontaneous or constructed perception of a state's role in major historical events, the burden of starting wider conflict would not be accompanied by applauses and gratitude for preventing World War II. How could we expect such a thing when the war, as we know it, would not have happened the way it did in our timeline? However, the crux of the problem lies in the fact that inaction also produces results. Therefore, it could be argued that action is necessary, while the choice of actions almost always relates to different shades of evil. The best we can hope for in such a framework is striving for the lesser evil. Returning to the game, we can say that Arthas, pressured by circumstances, has no room for delay. Assuming that everything that happens falls on his shoulders and that delaying action risks rebellion in his own ranks, he chooses what he sees as the lesser evil to avoid being a victim of events and instead become their creator. This is also a consequence of the double-edged nature of the governance system, where the individual stands at the center. As success will undeservedly be attributed to that individual, the same goes with blame. However, his pseudo-religious or ideological worldview, combined with the fact that he represents authority, allows Arthas to propose and then, when he takes command, to make snap decisions. We can say that he focuses on the outcome, even if it involves a massacre, which allows him to create events, but due to the nature of his decisions, leads to the loss of his humaneness. It's not hard to find arguments supporting the thesis that Arthas is taking a step that seems reasonable at the moment. First, it is obvious that the plague is present. Second, everyone has witnessed the speed at which it spreads. Third, all they know about it is that it's magical in nature. Fourth, the capacities they have are not sufficient to quarantine and isolate the city. And five, even if they succeed in that effort, the danger of violating the quarantine is enormous. Determined in his intent, especially since he previously received information from Kel'Thuzad that Mal'Ganis, the alleged leader of the Scourge, is in the city, Arthas takes action. At this point, it is worth pausing for a moment. One of the more common questions on forums discussing this topic is whether Arthas decided to act before or after learning that Mal'Ganis was indeed in the city. While it can be said that this question is of minor importance for the broader narrative, addressing it might provide additional arguments supporting the previously stated ideas. The information the prince has is what Kel'Thuzad gives him, but when he appears at the gates of Stratholme and decides to exterminate the local population, there is no clear evidence that this is true. The problem arises because Mal'Ganis' appearance in the game is timed to occur a few minutes after the mission begins. So if the player hasn't directed his troops towards the inhabitants by that time, he might get the impression that Arthas starts the massacre to stop Mal'Ganis from transforming the infected population into his army. However, besides the fact that in the scenes before the mission starts, it is clearly shown that he makes the decision without any proof of Mal'Ganis' presence, the book by Christie Golden completely removes this doubt. Thus, we get scenes of the massacre before Mal'Ganis appears, and the reflection on the emotion similar to happiness that Arthas felt when he met the Dreadlord, clearly indicating both that he was gambling when making his decision and that he had a completely twisted focus, as it is hard to understand how someone can feel any relief, let alone happiness, in such a moment. Even though his conjecture turned out to be correct in the first step, his understanding of the plague's source and the true leader of the Scourge was absolutely wrong. Let's return to Kissinger to shed more light on Uther's character. To deal with problems of such ambiguity presupposes above all a moral act, a willingness to run risks on partial knowledge and for a less than perfect application of one's principles. The insistence on absolutes is a prescription for inaction. Thus, we can assume that, unlike Artus, Uther, unburdened by the previously described weight of decision-making, focuses on the method, making him incapable of any action in a situation where there is no correct approach, but allowing him to retain his humanity. By deciding to do nothing, the experienced paladin partially washes his hands, convinced that refusing command and choosing the lesser evil leaves his soul untainted. However, consider the following. Not only does he refuse to be a part of the massacre, but he does not try to stop Artus either. Possibly not wanting to worsen the situation by inciting rebellion in the army and a potential civil war, Uther turns his back and leaves with a part of his knights, letting events unfold without his influence. In this regard, his end is symbolically perfectly framed when events, in the form of the fallen prince, catch him completely unprepared during the funeral procession for King Terenas Menethil II. Trapped in old patterns, Uther disappears along with the kingdom and the light he served, killed by the hand of the student he partially raised. And finally we come to Jaina. Given everything previously said about her, we can categorize her as a proactive character like Artus. However, considering she is an actor striving to uncover the truth, and given her more comfortable position compared to the Crown Prince in terms of the necessity for swift decision-making, her actions show that the problem of conjecture cannot be reduced to making or not making a decision, but must take into account its morality, the moment it is made, the type of decision, etc. Creating events instead of being their slave certainly, but not at the cost of humanity. She focuses on both the goal and the method. A new look at the rationale behind the decision to massacre the inhabitants of Stratholme can depict Jaina's position more clearly. Viewed a bit more broadly, the previously stated logic behind the decision to kill the inhabitants of Stratholme can be categorized as follows, which Jaina does in the literary treatment of the theme. First, what about the people who did not eat products made from tainted grain? Second, how can they know what the lethal dose is and measure who took how much? Third, how can they fight the disease if they kill everyone whose treatment would provide valuable insights into the plague's nature? Fourth, can someone be judged based on what they might do in the future, that is, before they take the problematic action, or, in our case, before they transform into a monster? Therefore, Jaina takes no action at the gates of Stratholme, either for or against Artus. However, returning to the burning city after the massacre, initially unable to accept that such suffering could have been caused by her beloved, she decides to inform Uther where the prince was headed. In doing so, the sorceress metaphorically removes the veil of bias from her own eyes, resulting in the appearance of the prophet, who reveals himself directly to her in the same scene as a physical manifestation of the unknown, bearing a message that the king, the wizard, and the prince previously refused to accept, but which she had intuited, symbolically represented through clumsy espionage. Jaina undergoes what could be called a post-traumatic growth, becoming the axis around which the remnants of humanity gather. Unfortunately, her role is not further elaborated. However, it is worth emphasizing that, unlike other actors exposed to the unknown due to their position in the structure, the sorceress recognized the significance of the unknown through her own actions. Even though she represents an aspect of the academic field, her position in it, unlike Antonidas's in the same or Terenas's and Artus's in the political field, is not guaranteed. Thus, position in the structure is secondary, though not unimportant. The problem of conjecture is, in fact, unimaginably complex. After all, it is only by utilizing the benefits of hindsight that we can judge decisions made under the pressure of time, which must temper our overly harsh judgments. Nevertheless, the unfolding of events undeniably confirms Jaina's approach as the only correct one.